Welcome, everyone. Good evening. How y'all all doing tonight? Thank you for being here. My name is Marcia Eli. We are at the Center for Brooklyn History. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Center for Brooklyn History, and also to give greetings on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, which I think many of you know we are now a part of, and the Arts and Culture team BPL presents. I want to especially thank the New York chapter of the American Constitution Society for your co-sponsorship of tonight's program, and welcome all of you to CBH who are from that community. This evening, we're honored to have with us esteemed legal scholar Michelle Adams, whose new book, as I think you may know, The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North, is the definitive history of Milliken v. Bradley, the epic case that effectively brought a halt to school segregation across the North. In his review published today in the New York Times, Jeffrey Toobin describes the book as splendid. He writes that Adams explores class as well as race with a richness and sophistication that recall J. Anthony Lucas's 1985 masterpiece, Common Ground. Tonight, Professor Adams will be in conversation with Aaron Robertson, author of the new book, The Black Utopians. Both books are available at the CBH shop, which is over there in that corner. You probably saw it as you came in, and there will be signing tonight following the conversation. Before I introduce Michelle and Adam more formally, I want to share a few related upcoming programs at CBH. Next week, we host the 3 city council members and our public advocate, Jelani Williams, whose legislation on reparations for slavery in New York City were passed this past fall. They're going to talk about their hopes and aspirations and the legislative work that is necessary for effective change. In February, we follow with a reparations part 2 that moves the discussion to the state level. We'll be welcoming 2 of the commissioners appointed to the New York State Community Commission on Reparation Remedies, Derek Hamilton and Lurie Daniel Favors. They will describe their work and the outcomes they hope to see. In March, we welcome historian Noli Rooks, traveling from Brown University to talk about her new book, Integrated: How America's Schools Failed Black Children. We're excited to host Russell Shorto and Ellie Mistal, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I hope that you'll sign up for our weekly emails and consider coming back for one or more of these great programs. Now let me share a few more details about our guests, and then invite them to the stage. Michelle Adams is the Henry M. Butzel Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, the former co-director of the Florsheim Center for Constitutional Democracy at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. She served on the Biden administration's Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. She was an expert commentator on the Netflix series Amend: The Fight for America, and the Showtime series Deadlocked: How America Shaped the Supreme Court. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, the Yale Law Journal, California Law Review, and other publications, and she was born and grew up in Detroit. Aaron Robertson's nonfiction debut, The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise in the Promised Land in America, was selected as a New York Times Notable Book of 2024, a Washington Post Notable Nonfiction Book of 2024, one of Time's 100 Must-Read Books of 2024, and one of the New York Public Library's 10 Best Books of 2024. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, many other publications, and he is also an acclaimed translator of Italian. So please, we're so excited to have you both here tonight. Please help me welcome Michelle and Aaron to the stage.
All right, it is so great to be here. Well, thank you for coming out to support Michelle's amazing book. I see that there's just a wonderful Michelle Adams, fan club here. So this truly is such a special moment for many reasons. One, this is a hell of a book. It is a legal thriller. It's the way that I've seen it. It's this account, a beautiful account of the way that the dream that Brown versus Board of Education promised us was killed, frankly. But it's also a book about, the kind of different visions that people had for the direction of this country. Those who really embraced sort of vision of integration, those who were skeptical of that dream. And so even beyond, just the actual legal case, Milliken versus Bradley, this is a beautiful account of a moment in American history where briefly it seemed that that our schools may have been integrated, right? That people would embrace that vision. But before we get into some of the fascinating characters and sort of narrative episodes that Michelle writes about, I want to start personally. So let's go back to 1967. You're 4 years old, I believe, in Michigan. Born in Detroit, but your parents decide to send you to the first private school in Michigan, Roper Day School. And you begin by wondering about that decision that your parents made. Can you take us back to that period? What was Roper? Why do you think your parents sent you there?
First of all, I want to say thank you all for coming tonight. This is fantastic. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to read my book and work with me on sort of figuring out, how we were going to have our conversation today. I so appreciate it. So you asked me to talk about, sort of take us back to 1967. So of course I don't remember 1967 very well. But I reflected on it when I thought about my parents, and they came up in the book, and the choices that they made for me. And I didn't understand for a long, long time, and I think quite frankly until I actually started reading this book, why they made a lot of the choices that they made. But the sort of choice that they made for me was to send me to a private school in Bloomfield Hills, which was, many miles away from where I grew up. And so as all the events were taking place, both in the city of Detroit in terms of the civil unrest there in 1967, and then subsequently what happened in the schools that we can talk about, I was going to school, an hour and a half away almost every day. And it was over that period of time where I recognized I was having a great experience there. I was taken seriously there as a young person, but there weren't that many other kids like me. But when I went home, it was the opposite. And I wondered why, and I wanted to understand that. And I started asking a lot of questions, and I think this book is a culmination of trying to answer the questions I started asking as I was a young person. Sort of, why does Detroit look the way it looks? Why is this school why am I going to school that's so far away from my house? Why are the sports teams that we play all predominantly white? What about, my friends' houses? When I went to my friends' houses, there weren't that many other kids like me who were there, and I wanted to know more. And I think that's been a process that I've gone through over the course of my life, and it culminated in thinking about writing this book.
You begin the book by writing or by laying out some of the sort of conflicts in Detroit that were going on between pro-integration supporters, so activists, politicians, education board members, and those who were advocating Black community control of schools. And one of the figures that you start with is someone who, interests us both, this Black nationalist minister named Albert Clegg Jr. I want you to talk a little bit about Clegg as a figure, and particularly why you begin your story with him? Because in a way, Clegg gets the ball rolling, like in this grand story that you're telling. Who was Clegg, and what was his complaint?
So I think it's really interesting that you and I sort of ended up at a relatively close period in time spending a lot of time with Clegg. And Clegg is, as you said, Detroit's leading black nationalist. And he is someone who's passionately interested in educating children, Detroit's black children. And he initially sort of started off working a bit with the NAACP in Detroit, and then felt like he had to go in a different direction. And what really starts the ball rolling in the book is this meeting that he goes to, sort of storms into the Detroit Public Schools regular meeting, and he's got a report in his hand, and the report is from his group called the Inner City Parents Council, and it lists and details all of the ways in which the Detroit Public Schools are separate and unequal and are miseducating black children. What's so interesting about this moment is that this is a time when the school board has been taken over by liberals. And this is really one of the first times that the school board actually cares about what's happening with black children. And so he's going in and he's going to confront them and tell them what's wrong. And what he wants is black schools for black children, right? He wants black control. He wants whites out of the schools. They've been miseducated. Get parents into the schools, get black teachers into the schools, and basically move whites out of the school system and out of the city of Detroit. He's an incredibly interesting character because, of course, it's 1970 or 1967, or in this period of time, and you've got these two sort of major schools of thought that we're quite familiar with, which is integrationism and sort of community control, which is what's sort of sweeping the nation in terms of education. And black nationalism. And so these two things come together and really begin this process that ends up on the doorstep of the United States Supreme Court. And so we can talk about the case and sort of how we get there, but what I didn't want to do in writing this book would be sort of like, well, there was this brief filed and there was that brief filed. What I wanted to do instead was to take a big step back and situate this case, as I think is an incredibly important and overlooked case, and talk about it from the perspective of the personalities in the case, the folks who actually sort of bring it to life and tell this incredibly engaging story. And the person that I begin with is Clegg, because he's such an important figure in Detroit, and because he really is the sort of leading force in community control and trying to take control of the schools that's happening right at this time. And he's the beginning of the book.
Right, and during this conversation, like what I really wanted to do is to speak about some of the characters and the people that you're writing about, because you'll read this book and you'll learn about all of the key cases that set essentially in motion the story that would eventually get us to Milliken versus Bradley. But it's a book that's not only about the education fight in Detroit, but it's really about the implication that this fight had for the country as a whole. And so a few of the characters you focus on are part of the national NAACP. So you have Robert Carter, who he served as the lead counsel for the NAACP. And then you have this amazing person, June Shagaloff, who is in some ways a kind of unexpected secret weapon that the NAACP has. And she is part of the effort to take the promises of Brown versus Board north. Can you talk about, one, what it was like to speak to her, because you were able to talk to her for the book, but also more broadly, how did the NAACP initially try to apply Brown versus Board of Education to the North?
So June Shagaloff is someone that I met when she was in her 90s. She very sadly passed just a couple of years ago. And she's been called sort of the Johnny Appleseed of organizing in the North. She was someone who sort of went coast to coast and was organizing Black communities, helping them try to figure out a way to desegregate the schools. And so she's part of a larger conversation that I think has gotten lost. And part of that conversation is that after Brown was decided in 1954, everything's happening in the South. Most of the focus is on the South, but you have lots of Black parents who are protesting, picketing, they're out in the streets in major cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Seattle, and what they want is they want desegregation. And so what June Shagaloff is doing is she's organizing these communities to try to figure out a way that they can sort of go to the school board and demand that the schools be integrated. Now, the other piece of it is sort of like, what's the NAACP doing, right? So the NAACP at this point is obviously quite committed to trying to figure out what are we gonna do in the South? But you've got Shagaloff and you've got Robert Carter, who's the general counsel for the NAACP. And he really believes strongly that what's happening in the North is just like what was going on in the South. That in fact, the schools were segregated, and they weren't just segregated because we don't know why, they were segregated because of government policy. And so what he wants to do is sort of push the NAACP to take on not just Southern segregation in the schools, but Northern segregation as well. And so he and June Shagaloff in the late 1950s, early 1960s, sort of go on this campaign of going across the country and trying to help organize folks to do that. I think the piece that's worth hanging on to, though, is one of the many untold stories of the book is just exactly how much activism was happening on the ground in the 1960s that was being driven not by sort of the higher-ups or whoever, it's being driven by Black parents. And so the question is, why are they so interested that they're gonna protest to get desegregation? And so that's part of the story that I'm trying to tell in the book as well, is that this is coming from quarters that we basically haven't thought that much about.
Yeah, and for me, I think the real story in the book begins in part because, Senator Coleman Young, who is best known for, he was the kind of longest serving mayor of Detroit, but before that, he was a state senator who was supporting the community control of schools. And so he has this controversial plan that he introduces before the state Congress to reorganize Detroit public schools. And, he gets his mandate, that passes. But the Board of Education in Detroit, this very liberal pro-integration board, decides to interpret that mandate in order to attempt to desegregate some schools in the city. It's not a very popular choice. Can you talk about the story of that choice?
I can, and I think the way to think about it is as a baton handoff. So we talked about Clegg, and we talked about him being the leading Black nationalist in the city of Detroit. And so he's pushing, right? And so Coleman Young, I think, is to a certain extent on the same side. And Coleman Young, begins as sort of a labor organizer and then becomes a state senator, as you suggested. And so Coleman Young says, well, how are we going to be able to get more power to the parents, right? We're gonna try to figure out a way. So the state passes a law that essentially allows the school board to be able to, what they call decentralize, right? But it doesn't say anything about how you go about doing it. So the whole idea is we're gonna figure out a way to get Black parents more involved in the schools, but we're gonna leave it up to the Detroit Board of Education to figure out exactly how to do that. So, you've got this handoff from Clegg to Coleman Young. Coleman Young spearheads this law, the law gets passed, and then you've got this liberal school board led by a very sort of active white integrationist named Abraham Zwerdling. And they basically say, we can't just figure out a way to decentralize that's going to further segregate the schools. We want to integrate them. And so Zwerdling decides what they're going to do is they're going to have this limited integration plan as part and parcel of this desegregation, of this decentralization idea, and that's when all hell breaks loose. And then there's for every action there's a reaction. Coleman Young gets involved again, and then ultimately the state decides to overturn the Board of Education's sort of very modest integration plan. And that's where the NAACP gets involved and decides to sue. And that sort of, so this is the whole background to this case that I wanted to go into great detail about so people could appreciate sort of where this is coming from. And so this is all happening before there's been a lawsuit brought. And so that's when the NAACP gets involved.
Right. And what I think is so spectacular about the book is that, you know, it's not only about the legal cases, but you really do a beautiful job of going into the motivations of politicians, of lawyers, but also of, you know, parent groups and students who were caught up in the middle of these, you know, desegregation efforts. I know that, you know, we talked a little bit backstage about the way you were thinking about this book, right? You didn't want it to just be about the cases. You were very attentive to telling like very human stories. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of actual craft of bringing these stories to life, and what kind of book were you trying to write?
I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk a little bit, just sort of folks have a sense of what the case actually did.
Yeah.
So, you know, I see so many faces in the audience of my friends and my family, and everybody knows, of my folks who are here, my people who are here, know this has taken me a long time. And the reason it's taken me such a long time is because I wanted to write a book that everyone could read. I wanted to write a book that was not only deeply personal, but that pivoted to a general nonfiction audience. And so for me, the idea was to engage in translation, which is to take all this legal doctrine that we teach in law school that actually can be quite complicated, but to be able not to dumb it down, but to explain it. And to explain it in a context where there was a story and where there was a narrative and where you could, I invite you to come with me on this legal journey. And I tried really hard to find a way to do that that was engaging, that was personal, and that was based with characters and with story. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I think this is such an incredibly important issue. But the other reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted to engage in demystification. There's so much mystification about what the Supreme Court does, how cases get decided, what happens when they go up there, what does the Constitution say. And in the mystification, there's power. And so one of the things I wanted to do was begin to break that down. And when you break that down, then the citizens of the United States, the people, can have a sense of what's going on, and we can actually take action. And so part of the background of the book is to be able to bring people into a conversation that they may feel they've been left out of.
That's great. And so let's go to the actual Bradley versus Milliken, not Milliken versus Bradley yet.
Okay, all right.
But, so this, in a sense, is, you know, I mean, this is the moment, I think, when you have these lawyers who are trying to prove, essentially, the ways that Detroit school officials were guilty of de jure, you know, segregation. So there was this notion that this idea that maybe, you know, segregation, like in the North, was de facto. It's just the way things were. But I think at the center of this case was what? This goal to, yeah.
So think about it like this. So, you know, close your eyes and go back to like 1954, 1955, and we think about the South, right? We think about whites only, drinking fountains, we think about not being able to vote, we think about signs. And it's very clear what the South is trying to do. And so it's not really an issue of sort of, were they trying to segregate? The answer was trying to get them to stop. But in the North, we didn't have that. We didn't have the laws, we didn't have the signs. It wasn't obvious what was happening. And so for a lot of people, they said, well, this segregation is a Southern phenomenon. It's not a Northern phenomenon at all. We don't know why the neighborhoods are racially identifiable, or there's a lack of racial balance, or whatever you want to call it. And so the issue for the lawyers is, once the state has decided that they're going to get rid of this integration plan. The issue for the lawyers is, well, how do we show that what's happening in the North is like what was happening in the South, but without the laws and without the signs and without any of that stuff? And so that's a really hard problem. And it's a particularly hard problem from a lawyer's perspective because all the Supreme Court law is happening in the South. So it's 1970, and all you really have are Southern cases. And so it's a difficult issue. So the lawyers say, we're going to put on this case. And we're going to try to show that, you use the phrase de facto, which basically means we don't know how it happened this way, right? De jure means by law, right? De facto means we don't know, right? And so what they want to do is they want to show, well, actually government policy was at the base of all of this. And this is a hard problem. How do they show that? Well, a lot of it is housing, right? This is ends up being a school case. It's about school segregation. But at the base of it is housing. Because what the city is doing is it's saying you have to go to school where you live. If you have to go to school where you live, if the neighborhoods are residentially segregated, then you're just going to carry that segregation over into the schools. So what had happened before was, the school authorities would say, we're not responsible for any of this. First of all, the neighborhoods aren't segregated. They are? I don't know. Who caused it? But second of all, even if they are, we're not responsible for it. We didn't do it. So there's no violation. There's no Brown has nothing to do with this. And so the lawyers decide they're going to put on what was the biggest housing case inside of a school case. So you have a 41-day trial, but 10 days of the trial are about housing. What happened in housing? Who was responsible? Racially restrictive covenants that ran with deeds that made it impossible for people to be able to sell their houses to African Americans and Jews. Redlining, which comes up a lot in my story, which is the idea that, well, if you live in certain neighborhoods, if you're African American, you can't get access to federally insured loans, you can't get access to any kind of federal housing assistance. There were 2 racially separate brokers groups in Michigan, and they were endorsed by the state of Michigan. All public housing in the state and across the country was also racially segregated. There were a whole lot of other things as well, but one of the things that they're trying to do is show all this in a school case. And so when they do this in the housing case, it's so extensive that you've got this judge who initially sort of thinks, this case is just a lot of BS. And then over time, he starts to really understand how it is that Northern Jim Crow actually functions. And effectively what you have in this trial is, it's how Northern Jim Crow behaved, how it was prosecuted, how it was created, how it was maintained. And that was the story within the story that I'm trying to tell. And it's that story that really sort of captivates, and it's the second portion of the book, where the lawyers are sort of furiously trying to figure out, well, how do we convince this judge? And the judge is moving from a position of being incredibly skeptical of what the lawyers are trying to say to actually, by the time the story is over, becoming sort of one of the nation's leading integrationists. Yeah,
this story of the federal judge you mentioned, Stephen Roth, he, I think, is the sort of most tragic almost figure like in this book, because he begins really skeptical of these lawyers who are trying to who are arguing so extensively about housing. But before we get into Roth, I would love for you to read one paragraph that really explains the title of this book, The Containment. These are the sort of mechanisms of northern segregation that you mentioned, and I think you do a beautiful job distilling what this means. So it's just at the bottom of 148 here. This paragraph.
So this is about this idea of the containment, and this became the way in which the lawyers tried to get at the judge and convince this judge. And this is in the housing portion of the case, and they're trying to basically explain how African Americans are contained in certain neighborhoods and they can't get out. So here I'm talking about it. The idea was to put as much geographical space as possible to erect impermeable buffer zones between the races. And when blacks spilled over one wall and escaped one zone, whites would erect yet another barrier and move further out. The process was dynamic, meaning it involved multiple parties. It was historic, meaning it had been going on for a very long time. It was common, meaning it characterized not just Detroit, but most, if not all, major cities and metropolitan areas. And it had never stopped. This was how the ghetto was built.
That's great. Yeah, and so, you know, a part of this book is laying out, you know, what is decontainment, what is Northern style segregation, but then you also write extensively about the notion of remedy. How, you know, if you know, northern school districts have been shown to intentionally, you know, segregate, then what are the remedies for this? And one of the unexpected turns that you write about comes from this group, the Citizens Committee for Better Education, which you know is definitely not a pro-integration movement in Detroit. But there's a man who's a part of this group, Alexander Ritchie, who, like in a way, starts to plant this idea in Judge Roth's head about what the best way would be to fix Northern, you know, segregation. So can you talk about Ritchie and what his role was in this story?
So we back up for a second and think about a case, and normally the case is between the plaintiffs who are bringing the case and the defendants. In this case, remember it started out with the NAACP challenging the law that had overturned the integration plan, and then it got much larger and looked at sort of all of school segregation in Detroit. At some point, a bunch of white families said, you know what, we're really worried about this case. These are white Detroiters now. We're concerned that if the plaintiffs win this case, it's going to mean that we're going to have to actually integrate the schools, and we want to have white control of white schools. So they intervene or they become members of the case. This is CCBE. And I had always thought, and one would think that if you were going to start talking about things like having large-scale integration and going across the borders and bringing in suburban school districts or any of that, that would have come from the plaintiffs, the NAACP. It didn't. It came from CCBE. It came from the white residents of northern Detroit who were in this lawsuit, and they say to themselves, well, listen, if we're going to be on the hook and have to integrate our schools, our white folks in the suburbs ought to be with us. And so what they wanted to do is basically have a huge metropolitan integration remedy that included the suburban school districts. But that came from CCBE. It came from other white people. And that was just a shock even for me, for someone who had been sort of thinking about these cases and thinking about this area of law for a long time. The idea that, you know, this first comes into the case and it gets the judge's attention from these white folks. And of course, the reason they want them there is because they think, well, you know, we're going to be able to leverage the political power of the suburban school districts. But they're also saying, it's sort of admitting that in fact, everything is segregated. It is related to sort of where you live. And so this is the way in which this whole idea gets into the judge's head.
Yeah, and you know, the evidence is so overwhelming for Judge Roth that you know, he determines that the only way to possibly, you know, fix the extreme segregation that defined Detroit public schools was to look outside of Detroit, this place that was so vastly segregated that there could not be a real viable solution within the city. This caused, you know, this was the impetus essentially that took us to Milliken versus Bradley. But can you talk about, you know, what the effects of Roth's ruling in Detroit, and also what was happening around the country, you know, that made this ruling possible? Because you know, this was not only a Detroit, focus story.
Well, and just so we're together, so the plaintiffs win their lawsuit, right? The NAACP wins the lawsuit, and the question is, what's the remedy for that? And CCB had been sort of whispering in the judge's ear. And the judge says, I think we ought to basically bring in about 50 or so suburban school districts. And the idea was to basically knit together all of southeastern Michigan. This would have affected about 800,000 students. This is the remedy, he thinks, because there's been a Brown violation. There's been a violation of the Constitution. And it would have been the largest metropolitan school desegregation remedy in the history of the United States. Roth effectively orders it, it's upheld on appeal, and then we get to the Supreme Court and we can talk about what happened there. But the other part of your question had to do with what's going on around the country. Do you mean legally, or you just mean?
Well, I mean, a part of the book is also, I think, one of the really compelling narrative threads revolves around the concept of busing, which became, obviously this loaded political issue. But I think what you argue so beautifully is that this insistence on the dangers of busing, right, which is something that President Nixon really endorsed, and also people like Irene McCabe, who you write about, who was a anti-busing activist in Pontiac.
And a very telegenic one.
A very effective one, yes. This was really a method to distract people from the fact that there was a violation that had been committed. So, what I'm asking is, talk a little bit about the role of busing in this, the conversations around busing, at this moment.
So busing's really interesting. I think about it a lot like colorblindness, which is sort of, if you don't like what they're saying, change the conversation. And so if the conversation is the North is just as segregated as the South, maybe even more so, and there was a lot of bylaw segregation in the North just as well. Oh, and by the way, there's tons of these little small school districts, and we should bring them all together. This kind of thing can get, very radical very quickly. And I think one of the ways to kind of distract from that, and the change from the sort of mid-60s, late 60s over to the 70s, is to change the topic. We're not talking about segregation anymore. We're not talking about Brown anymore. We're not talking about constitutional violations anymore. We're not talking about what's in the best interest of black children anymore. Suddenly we're talking about busing. Busing is just a mechanism for kids to get to school. But now that's the new conversation. Just like colorblindness is a new conversation, but it's a way of changing the subject. And the reason I said that Irene McCabe was so telegenic is that I think she's one of the people who really just changes the nature of the discussion. She was an anti-busing activist out of Pontiac, Michigan, who just got a tremendous amount of publicity and just sort of took the busing issue and just ran with it. And suddenly we were having very, very different conversations.
And, the court that hears Milliken versus Bradley is, it's not the Warren Court anymore, right? This is a court that has been transformed by particularly two key appointments that President Nixon makes. I know that we'll be short on time, but I wonder if you can talk about the way that Nixon really helped transform the court at this time, and how that affected, really the fate of desegregation efforts in the North.
So there are a number of themes in my book, and one of the themes is democracy. And we can talk about little d democracy, big D democracy, and democratic socialization, which I think is what I think integration is all about. The little d democracy was all of the black activists who were pushing for desegregation in the 60s. The big D democracy, in terms of sort of electoral outcomes, was the election of 1968, which was incredibly important. So Nixon comes in and ultimately gets 4 Supreme Court appointments, and you move from the most sort of liberal court that we'd had in the history of the United States, and a fairly atypical one, to the Burger Court, And so Nixon appoints Warren Burger as the Chief Justice. And for many years, the thought was, well, the Burger Court is basically a nothing burger. Nothing really happened. They weren't that conservative. It was really just a way station to the really conservative Rehnquist Court and the even more uber-conservative Roberts Court, which is what we have today. But actually, I think it turns out that the Burger Court was doing a lot more work than that. And, you know, the Milliken versus Bradley case is a good example of the court being incredibly conservative. Why do I say that? Well, for instance, the trial court judge made this decision on liability that, in fact, the city and the state had been discriminating against black children for a very long time. This was upheld twice by the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And we get to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, you know, we aren't going to mess with anything having to do with what they proved. Everything that they proved was okay. What the lawyers call liability was all okay. It's really the remedy that's the problem. It's really the fact that what we're going to do is we're going to send black kids to suburban schools and send white suburban students to city schools. That's the problem, right? It's not that there's been a constitutional violation. We don't disagree about that. But it's the remedy. The remedy was too big. It was too radical. It was too large. And it had to be stopped. And so this is really the key part, and I think that it also points to the idea that being able to control the Supreme Court is extraordinarily important. And that can only be done under our system when you win elections. And Nixon getting 4 appointees had just a tremendous impact that we're still feeling today. Because not only was that court more conservative than I think people thought it was, it set the court for the Rehnquist Court, and then set the table for the Rehnquist Court, and then set the table yet again for the Roberts Court.
There are so many consequences that come out of Milliken versus Bradley. Of course, you have the very concrete reality that efforts to desegregate across metropolitan districts become so much more difficult. There are, I think, 15 instances in the 1970s and 80s where those kinds of remedies were applied, but that, it's such a small speck across the country. But I think for me, one of the revealing things about this case is that there were sort of two ways, I think, of looking at reality, like in this country. There was one that was very attentive to all of the layered reasons and all of the actors who participated, like in segregation, right? Like it was such a complex, intricate web, which is what it's what the containment was all about, right? It wasn't just the housing industry. It was so many actors. And then on the other hand, and this is the vision of reality that seemed to prevail, there was this notion that discrimination or segregation was an easily isolated act. And there were clear, it was very clear when someone made the choice to segregate. And I'm curious whether you think that way of thinking, well, how that way of thinking has continued into the present. But also, I do want to end on a somewhat hopeful note too, which is, and so this is part two of the question, the fight to desegregate is not over. There are still efforts, to attempt to remedy the situation. And so I do wonder what gives you hope, despite the fact that Milliken versus Bradley had such, harmful consequences.
That's a big two-part question.
It is a very big two-part question.
Yeah.
But let's do the hopeful one, maybe. So what?
Just 1 second on the first part.
Okay.
I guess my takeaway from spending all this time in the archives and all this time reading is that things are more complicated than they might appear. But just because they're more complicated than they might appear doesn't mean they didn't happen. And I think that's really important to hang on to. One of the things I'm trying to do with the book is the contribution that I want to make with this book is to tell a story, but to tell a story in a way that folks can hang on to and be able to carry with them. And the idea that, Jim Crow was a kind of regional phenomenon is wrong. The idea that there's a distinction between de jure by law and de facto segregation is also incorrect. And so, but in order to be able to appreciate that, you have to take a step back and kind of look at the whole thing. And the contribution I'm trying to make is to allow us to be able to do that in a way that helps us all understand better. Now, on the more hopeful note, which I talk about towards the end of the book, there are a lot of people and a lot of organizations today that are working on this issue, and that's one of the things I found out as well. In fact, I think I see Sonia Park in the audience, who runs a diversity for charter schools organization, right? And so there's so many different people doing so many different things that leaves me hopeful. I think one of the things we have to do is sort of raise the demand, right, for more integrated schools. And so one of the ways we can do that is just read books like mine and think more about it and to sort of see what the benefits of integration are that we can talk about. But I actually think that there is a strong movement that's happening, but it's sort of all over the place. People doing different kinds of things, and it hasn't necessarily coalesced. And I'd like to be able to think that that will happen.
That's great. I think we'll go into questions now, but I just want to commend you again on a really, just a spectacular book. I think it's going to be one of the most important of this year. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
So now, we have questions.
Thank you. Michelle, instead of busing, what would have been an effective and appropriate remedy?
Busing is a tool that gets students from school A to school B. I think an effective remedy would have been to uphold the trial court's order that would have required 50 some odd school districts to engage in two-way transfers. There's a variety of things you can do. Walk-in schools, you can do some busing, you can pair schools together. A lot of it depends upon the geography, and so there are some suburban school districts that were right on the border of Detroit where it would have been quite easy and the transportation times were not very long. So a more effective remedy would have been to move towards a situation where our students are educated together as opposed to apart.
Thank you. Hi, Michelle, and thanks for the shout out. I appreciate it. So I would love your thoughts on a movement coming out more from the right now on open enrollment and opening up districts across the board. And it seems to be gathering steam, especially for folks that may be leaning towards choice in the very broadest sense, not just for public schools, but for ESAs and vouchers, and now taking up the call for open enrollment and eliminating district lines altogether.
Well, I have to take a look at that. I haven't seen that much about that yet, so we're going to have to sort of see what happens over this next year, particularly as we get the changeover in the Department of Education. I have to say that I would be very interested to see if, in fact, that is reality. The idea that, in fact, we would have open enrollment and we would have open transfers and it would be very easy to go from one district to another. I think the devil's in the details, and so I'd want to look more and sort of see what the actual idea behind that is. I will say that increasing the ability of students to be able to make transfers, I think, is important, and you've got to do that also within a paradigm that allows for parents to have choice, because parents really like choice. So this is not necessarily going to be easy, but it can be done. But I want to see the details before I would make any kind of any statement based on that.
Professor Adams, or I should say the Professor Adams, as was in the subhead of your review. I have two questions, actually. One that follows on what you were just saying, and then another broader one. The one that follows on what you were saying is, as you were writing the book and looking at parents, and you just said parents like to have choice, I mean, one of the challenges is often that some parents are very engaged and are ready and prepared to learn a lot, and many are not. And so I wonder if, as you've, from all of the work you've done, if you have thoughts on how to engage or reach parents who are not being reached by the range of opportunities. The part two, I'm following your footsteps here. The part two is really to ask you to reflect as in writing this book. I mean, we could talk for another hour about this, but I wonder if you could share at least one thing that really surprised you. I mean, I know there's a ton you learned, but one thing that surprised you in the course of the writing.
Thank you for that question, Professor Goldberg. Let me start, that's a two-part question. Let me start with part two. Yes. One of them was something I've already mentioned, which was that an all-white anti-integration group was the group that introduced the idea of suburban-urban desegregation into a lawsuit. I thought that was pretty surprising, and it was counterintuitive, let's put it that way. I would say the other thing that surprised me was, and this is not huge numbers, I don't want to overstate it, but there were a number of white parents, particularly white moms, who sort of, while this was bubbling up, and this is in suburban areas, were basically saying, looks like we're going to have this lawsuit. It looks like it's going to mean that there's going to have to be desegregation. Let's begin to organize with Black parents to figure out a way to facilitate this process. And what was so interesting as I read the media, my media diet of the time was sort of reading the front page of the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press is, you'd see all these articles about all the white folks and all the ways they were behaving extraordinarily badly, and they were. But then back in the women's pages, in section C, about the girls, would be these stories about how women were basically engaging and organizing across district lines. And it's just a story that's not there, and part of the reason the story is not there is because it's not, it wasn't taken seriously. Women were doing it, so it didn't matter. One of the tragedies of the Milliken versus Bradley case was that sort of cross-district city-suburban organization that was going on basically dies when the Milliken case overturns that order. On the first one, in terms of how do you reach parents, I guess what I would focus more on, and what I've been focusing on, is sort of what my contribution is to that. And it is, I want to create demand, and that's why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to reach a wide audience, to give people an understanding of what happened, but also to sort of say, here are some heroes, maybe here are some villains, here are some people that you might want to emulate. And so I think what my project is to try to move that more into the national conversation. I think you can reach people. I think it's hard, and I think a lot of it depends upon engagement, which is something I think you're very interested in as well. So I think I would leave it at that.
Hi, Professor Adams. You will never be Michelle to me. But you
can try.
You mentioned one of the lessons of Milliken is small d democratic socialization. I just wonder if you consider kind of a theme within that lesson to be the tension between the idea or ideal of the equal protection of the laws against the reality of the collective sacrifice it takes to get there.
Yeah, so I realized that I talked about big D, little d, but I didn't talk about democratic socialization, and that sort of puts me into talking about the values of integration. And this is not me. This is not me, a law professor talking. This is, let's just listen to Thurgood Marshall, right? Thurgood Marshall in the dissent in Milliken versus Bradley says that if our children can't learn together, they're never going to be able to live together. And I think this is true. It is not going to be easy, and it never has. But the democratic socialization is what many social scientists have noted when we actually put students together in the same space, particularly at the youngest ages. By the time we're talking about college, it's awfully late. But when you put students together under conditions of equality, right? Under conditions of equality, you get better outcomes from white children, essentially. You get white folks who aren't quite as prejudiced, who aren't quite as biased, who make different choices about how they're gonna live their lives and where they're gonna live and who they're gonna marry and who they're gonna vote for. And so I think that's the democratic socialization piece, and I think all three of those Ds are present in my book. With respect to, I think I heard in your comment was the cost on Black children, right? And one of the things I will never do is second guess a Black parent. I will never second guess a Black parent against the existing reality of what the educational choices are today. And I have nothing but extraordinary, I'm in awe of Black parents who made the decision to sort of send their kids initially when the kids had to basically run into a buzzsaw. That's real, right? That's real. But what we do know when we look at the studies, and we look at there's a couple of them that I mentioned in the book, some work that's been done by Rutger Johnson at Berkeley, and then also a 2022 massive data set, longitudinal study, is that Black students have done much better in desegregated districts than in districts that were segregated, but also white students didn't have the kind of problems that were predicted by segregationists, and white students on average and over time make the kinds of choices that we want them to make if we want to have a multiracial democracy. So I think that's the sort of longer answer to that.
What I'll say too, sorry, just very quickly, at the end of the book, one of the things you note is that actually a majority of Americans have said that they are in support of integration, but one of the obstacles is that there is a fear that the consequences of that, particularly among white Americans, there's a fear that it won't be worth the effort, and so
Yeah.
that contrast is striking.
Well, while we were doing shout-outs, right, so the Century Foundation and the Bridges Collaborative have done a lot of work on this too, but some of it's been polling and trying to figure out, one of the things I said I want to do with the book was stimulate demand. There is more demand for integrated educational opportunities than there are such opportunities, right? So one thing we want to think about is how can we create different kinds of structures so that parents can actually, have their demands met, right? And so the way that we structure things now, including the thing that I think a lot of parents really love, is the neighborhood school, right? Historically, the neighborhood school has been a way to incorporate residential segregation into the schools. So I think that there's a tension with respect to the neighborhood school. You've got to obey parent choice, but you've also got to sort of open up and talk about sort of what that has meant, and that's part of what's going on in the background of the book as well.
There was a question in the back, I'm sorry.
I have to continue with the Professor Adams because it seems important.
Thank you, Professor Godsell.
Professor Adams, something that you just said about what the story that this book is telling that has the potential to really, truly transform the narrative, it actually strikes me that having this book as a new book for us to read, Common Ground is a masterpiece, but Common Ground gives a picture of busing that's basically, and I'm Irish Catholic, sending kids from one neighborhood that is struggling to another neighborhood that is absolutely catastrophically struggling, filled with Irish Catholic parents who didn't know what to do with their kids and who were struggling themselves, was obviously what the story that was told in Common Ground. And it seems like you're telling what could have been a potentially very different story. And that narrative potentially could be one that if we learn it, it will give us that hope. Does that seem to ring true to you?
Yeah, when I read the review today, I was struck because, Common Ground is a book that's just, it's a totem in the field. But I think, if memory serves me, I think you're correct about that. I have many friends in the audience, and they know that I have a level of optimism, some might say naivete. But I do think that there's a different story to be told, right? When we think about desegregation, we think failure. When we think about busing, we think anger. We think about they didn't want it. The whole thing has been run through a sort of conservative lens and frame. And what I want to do is step back and talk about what kinds of opportunities we could have had and might still be able to have from a positive perspective. And I think the Century Foundation stuff where we see parents saying, we want to have integrated schools and we can't get them, right? Because there's so many different structural barriers. That's a really different story than saying the whole thing failed and we should never try again. So I thank you for saying that this is going to be that kind of contribution. I hope it will be.
I think, do we have any more? Or one more here on the aisle?
Hi. I clerked for Judge Carter, so thank you for remembering him. Parents involved is one of those hurdles that you just referenced, where the Supreme Court barred even voluntary desegregation efforts. How do we get around that, and even the looming idea that even the intention of desegregation using proxies, like zip code, like poverty, it's a case called TJ. So I'm less optimistic than you are, because I see those Supreme Court decisions, or looming Supreme Court decisions in the case of TJ, as really problematic.
So I look forward to having your thoughts on the book. The very first, even before the first chapter, there's a prologue, and it starts in the Supreme Court building. I'm there for the oral arguments for parents involved. And I take the reader through what it was like to kind of watch the oral arguments unfold and what was going through my head and just sort of what that experience is. So Parents Involved comes up a number of times in the course of the book. On Parents Involved, it's not a great case, decided in 2007. You're right that the court said that, I mean, it's famous for Chief Justice Roberts saying the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I mean, that's what we're dealing with, right? But, you know, the mechanisms that were used were explicitly race-based. They were voluntary in the sense that there was no court order requiring either Louisville or Seattle to have those plans, but they did use race expressly. And so Parents Involved says that you can't do that. And in fact, there's 5 votes in Parents Involved that stand for the proposition that you can take actions that are what is called facially race neutral with the desire to be able to obtain desegregation. Now, or diversity. What you're getting at now is sort of the Harvard UNC cases and the fact that we may be going to a scenario where if you have that mindset, if you have an integration mindset, that motivation might actually violate the Equal Protection Clause. We aren't there yet. You know, don't obey in advance. That would be really bad. I wrote an article about, 10 years ago called "Is Integration a Discriminatory Purpose?" So I've been worried about this for a while. It would be super bad. It would be super bad. You know, if they do that, we're going to have to go back into the political process and win some elections and change the Supreme Court, right? I think that we should my humble opinion is that the folks on the ground who are doing this work should continue to do this work, and if the Supremes end up saying that we can't do this work, then we're going to have to go back to electoral process and win some elections and change the court.
I think on that note, we'll call it an event. But thank you so much, Professor Adams.